James Cameron sold his screenplay for $1. Not $1,000, not $10,000, but literally one single dollar bill. That screenplay became The Terminator, which went on to make $78 million at the worldwide box office. But this isn't just a story about money. It's about how one man's stubborn belief in his vision changed Hollywood forever, and how the craziest gamble in entertainment history actually paid off. Before James Cameron became the king of Hollywood blockbusters, he was just another guy trying to make ends meet in Southern California. He wasn't born into the movie business. There was no trust fund, no family connections, no agent looking out for him. Instead, Cameron drove trucks to pay his rent, worked as a janitor cleaning office buildings at night, and spent his free time obsessively studying how movies were made. He would sit in theaters watching Star Wars over and over again, not for entertainment, but to figure out how George Lucas pulled off those incredible special effects on a relatively small budget. Cameron taught himself everything. He read every book on filmmaking he could get his hands on, practiced building miniature models and effects in his garage, and slowly worked his way into the world of low-budget B-movies. This wasn't glamorous work by any stretch of the imagination, but it was his film school, and every day he was learning something new about the craft he was desperate to master. Cameron's first real shot at directing came with a sequel to a low-budget horror movie called Piranha Part 2: The Spawning. On paper, it looked like his big break. Finally, someone was willing to let him sit in the director's chair and call the shots. But what should have been his Hollywood debut turned into a complete nightmare that almost ended his career before it even started. The production was chaotic from day one. There were language barriers with the Italian crew. The producers kept interfering with his creative decisions, and the budget was so tight that basic equipment kept breaking down. According to most accounts, Cameron was removed from the director's chair after just a couple of weeks, essentially fired from his own movie. The experience was humiliating, devastating, and exactly the kind of setback that makes most people give up on their Hollywood dreams. But instead of quitting, Cameron learned something crucial from this failure. If the industry wasn't going to hand him opportunities, he would have to create something so compelling, so undeniably brilliant, that they would have no choice but to take notice. Then, in 1981, something extraordinary happened that would change not just Cameron's life, but the entire landscape of science fiction cinema. Cameron was in Rome, still dealing with the aftermath of his directing disaster, when he came down with a severe fever that left him bedridden for several days. During one particularly intense fever dream, he saw a vision that was so vivid, so terrifying, and so cinematically perfect that it would haunt him for months to come. In this dream, he witnessed a metallic endoskeleton, half human, half machine, walking through flames with glowing red eyes, completely relentless in its mission to kill. The image was so powerful, so immediately cinematic, that Cameron woke up and started sketching frantically, trying to capture every detail of what he had seen. He drew the metal skull, the glowing eyes, the mechanical body, and as he sketched, an entire story began to form in his mind. What if machines from the future came back in time to change the course of human history? What if artificial intelligence became so advanced that it decided humanity was the enemy? What if the fate of the world came down to one woman, one protector, and one seemingly unstoppable killing machine? Over the next several months, Cameron developed this fever dream into a full screenplay, writing and rewriting until he had crafted something that was part horror movie, part chase thriller, and part science fiction epic. If you're loving this underdog story of how one man's vision changed Hollywood, hit that subscribe button right now. Cameron knew he had something special with the Terminator script, but convincing Hollywood to let him direct it was an entirely different challenge. He started making the rounds to various studios and production companies, and the response was almost universally the same. They loved the concept, they loved the story, but they had serious doubts about letting a relatively unknown filmmaker take control of the project. Meeting after meeting, Cameron heard variations of the same crushing rejection. "Great story, kid. We'll definitely want to buy this script from you, but we're going to need to bring in a real director to actually make the movie." The studios saw dollar signs when they read the screenplay, but they couldn't see past Cameron's limited track record and his one major failure with Piranha Part 2. From their perspective, it made perfect business sense. Why risk millions of dollars on an unproven director when you could buy his script and hand it over to someone with an established reputation? But Cameron had learned something crucial from his previous disaster. Creative control was everything, and if he sold his script without retaining the right to direct, he would just be handing over his vision for someone else to potentially ruin. After dozens of rejections and months of frustration, Cameron made what many people in Hollywood thought was the craziest decision they had ever heard. Cameron walked into the office of producer Gail Ann Hurd with what sounded like the most ridiculous proposition in Hollywood history. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "I will sell you the Terminator screenplay for exactly $1, but there's one non-negotiable condition: I have to be the director." Most people in Hurd's position would have laughed him out of the room, but she recognized something in Cameron's absolute determination that made her take the offer seriously. This wasn't just about money for Cameron. This was about creative control, about proving that he could deliver on his vision, and about betting everything he had on his own abilities. Hurd agreed to the deal, and just like that, Cameron had traded away what could have been hundreds of thousands of dollars in script fees for the chance to sit in the director's chair. The contract was signed, $1 changed hands, and Cameron finally had his shot to prove that his fever dream could become a cinematic reality. But now came the really hard part. He had to actually make the movie, and he had to do it with a budget so small that most Hollywood directors would have considered it impossible. The Terminator had a total budget of just $6.4 million, which sounds like a lot of money until you realize that most major Hollywood productions were spending 10 times that amount. Cameron had to get creative with every single aspect of the production. He couldn't afford big-name actors, elaborate sets, or expensive special effects, so he had to find ways to make everything look bigger and more impressive than it actually was. The casting process was particularly challenging because the role of the Terminator required someone who could be physically intimidating while delivering dialogue in a way that felt genuinely robotic and inhuman. Most established actors either weren't interested in the role or couldn't pull off the specific combination of physicality and cold, mechanical delivery that Cameron was looking for. That's when a young Austrian bodybuilder named Arnold Schwarzenegger walked into the audition, and Cameron immediately knew he had found his killer robot. Schwarzenegger's thick accent, which had been considered a liability in his previous acting attempts, was actually perfect for the character. It made him sound even more alien and machine-like. His massive physical presence and ability to deliver lines with absolutely no emotion created exactly the menacing, unstoppable force that Cameron had envisioned in his fever dream. For the special effects, Cameron drew on all the skills he had learned during his years working on low-budget B-movies. He built the Terminator's endoskeleton in his own garage, used clever camera angles and mirrors to make small sets look enormous, and created practical effects that would look convincing on screen without breaking his tiny budget. The actual filming of the Terminator was just as challenging as everything that had led up to it, and Cameron's perfectionist nature meant that he pushed his small crew to their absolute limits every single day. They were shooting on locations around Los Angeles with a schedule so tight that there was no room for major mistakes or expensive reshoots. Cameron had to be incredibly efficient with every shot, every take, and every dollar they spent, because unlike the big studio productions, they didn't have the luxury of going over budget or extending their shooting schedule. One of the most famous scenes in the movie, where the Terminator cuts open his own arm to reveal the mechanical endoskeleton underneath, was achieved using a combination of makeup effects, carefully designed prosthetics, and Cameron's own hand-built mechanical components, all for a fraction of what a major studio would have spent on similar effects. The production was so low budget that Arnold Schwarzenegger actually worked for scale, meaning he was paid the minimum amount allowed by union rules, because he believed in the project and wanted to be part of something special. Cameron's relentless attention to detail and his ability to create convincing effects on a shoestring budget meant that audiences would never guess how little money was actually behind the impressive visuals they were seeing on screen. When The Terminator finally hit theaters on October 26, 1984, absolutely nobody in Hollywood was prepared for what happened next. The movie opened on a relatively modest number of screens because the distributors weren't expecting it to be anything more than a decent B-movie that might make back its small budget. But from the very first weekend, it was clear that audiences were responding to something much more powerful than anyone had anticipated. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. People were coming out of theaters talking about this intense, relentless thriller that felt unlike anything they had ever seen before. Critics were initially divided. Some dismissed it as just another low-budget sci-fi action movie, while others recognized that Cameron had created something genuinely innovative in terms of pacing, visual effects, and pure cinematic intensity. But the audience response was unmistakable. The Terminator was becoming a cultural phenomenon, and the box office numbers proved it. By the time it finished its theatrical run, the movie had earned over $78 million worldwide, which represented more than 12 times its original production budget. That kind of return on investment was the stuff of Hollywood legend. And suddenly James Cameron went from being an unknown director who had been fired from his first movie to being one of the most sought-after filmmakers in the industry. Arnold Schwarzenegger's cold, robotic delivery of the line, "I'll be back," became instantly iconic, launching his career as one of the biggest action stars in the world. The success of the Terminator didn't just change Cameron's career. It completely transformed his life and gave him the creative freedom that he had been fighting for since the beginning. Suddenly, studios that had previously refused to let him direct were lining up to work with him, and he had the leverage to demand not just creative control, but also the budgets necessary to bring his increasingly ambitious visions to life. His next project was Aliens, the sequel to Ridley Scott's sci-fi masterpiece, and Cameron proved that the Terminator wasn't a fluke by delivering another intense, action-packed thriller that became both a critical and commercial success. From there, he went on to direct Terminator 2: Judgment Day, which had a budget of over $100 million, more than 15 times what he had to work with on the original film. Then came True Lies, followed by Titanic, which became the highest-grossing movie of all time and won Cameron the Academy Award for Best Director. Years later, he would break his own record with Avatar, which utilized groundbreaking 3D technology and computer-generated effects that revolutionized how movies could be made. Today, James Cameron's films have earned over $6 billion at the worldwide box office, making him one of the most commercially successful directors in the history of cinema. But every single one of these massive achievements can be traced back to that $1 contract and his stubborn refusal to let anyone else tell his story for him. So what can we learn from James Cameron's incredible $1 gamble that changed the course of his entire life? First and most importantly, sometimes the most valuable thing you can trade away is money itself, especially when you're exchanging it for something that money can't buy: creative control over your own vision. Cameron understood that if he had taken the traditional route and sold his script for a large upfront payment, he would have been just another screenwriter watching someone else potentially ruin his carefully crafted story. Instead, he made the radical decision to bet everything on himself and his own abilities, even when the entire industry was telling him that he wasn't qualified to direct his own material. Second, Cameron's success wasn't just about having a great idea. It was about having the technical knowledge and practical experience to execute that idea on a limited budget. All those years he spent learning special effects, studying filmmaking techniques, and working on low-budget productions gave him the skills he needed to make the Terminator look like a much more expensive movie than it actually was. Third, timing and persistence were crucial. Cameron didn't just write a good script and hope for the best. He spent months refining his vision, shopping it around, and refusing to compromise on the elements that were most important to him. And finally, Cameron's story reminds us that the biggest breakthroughs often come from the smallest, most seemingly insignificant decisions. In this case, literally a $1 transaction that seemed crazy to everyone except the person making it. James Cameron's $1 gamble teaches us that sometimes the most important investments aren't measured in dollars and cents, but in belief. Belief in your own vision, belief in your own abilities, and belief that you can create something that the world has never seen before. The next time someone tells you that your idea isn't worth much, or that you should let someone else handle the important parts, remember the story of a broke truck driver who refused to compromise on his fever dream and ended up changing Hollywood forever. Cameron could have taken the safe route, sold his script for a decent amount of money, and spent the rest of his life wondering what might have been if someone else had directed the Terminator. Instead, he made the hardest choice possible. He bet everything on himself, traded immediate financial security for long-term creative control, and proved that sometimes the craziest risks lead to the biggest rewards. So I'll ask you this. If you had a vision that you absolutely believed in, what would you be willing to risk to see it come to life? Would you trade a guaranteed payday for the chance to prove that you could do it better than anyone else? James Cameron did exactly that with $1 and a Dream, and it made him one of the most successful filmmakers in the history of cinema. What would you bet $1 on? Let me know in the comments below what risks you'd be willing to take to turn your vision into reality. And if you enjoyed learning about the incredible business gambles and creative risks that built the entertainment industry, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories about people who risked everything and won. Because sometimes, the best investments are the ones that seem completely crazy to everyone else.